I run a business called Collector's Trove. I basically run auctions for RPG designers, artists, and insiders. And so I've had a lot of exposure to the history of the game over the years, and a lot of the items in here are from my personal collection, and then the rest of them are things that I've sold to other collectors for various artists and designers. Let's see, where shall I start? GenCon started in 1967 when Gary Gygax asked about 20 guys to come over to his house and play for the weekend. They came over on a Saturday, and a lot of them brought sleeping bags and slept in the living room and on a side porch of 330 Center Street in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. At the time, he had 4 little kids in the house, and when all of these gamers were in the house, you can imagine there wasn't any place that you could go to avoid the noise. And Mary Jo, his wife, would often say that till 2 or 3 in the morning, her babies would be woken up by all the sounds of gaming in the basement, or somebody yelling huzzah all of a sudden from the basement and it rattling up through the vents to the kids upstairs. So, and the whole family slept in a really small space, basically in the attic. And in order to get to the girls' bedroom, the kids had to walk over mom and dad's bed to get to the bedroom. The boys had their own bedroom, but the bathroom was right next to theirs, so anybody who had to go to the bathroom had to walk through their bedroom. And so it was a pretty tight living space, but they were a very loving family, and Mary Jo was really supportive of Gary. And so when he said he was going to have a couple guys over for gaming for the weekend, and they did, and they often hosted people. Now Gary didn't drive, so if you notice, all the early Gen Cons are held at Horticulture Hall, which is 1 block from his house, or the American Legion Hall, which is 3 blocks from his house. And most of those early war games, he would have people over to his house, and they would either camp at the local campground for $1.50 a day, and they would pay $1 to get into Gen Con, and they could get hot dogs and a sunshine soda for 50 cents. You probably paid about 150 times more than that to be here today. But so Gary had started a group. He had a good friend named Bill Spear and another friend named Scott Duncan, and they had a postal diplomacy game called a postal wargaming club called the U.S. Continental Army Command. Gary decided that maybe that wasn't the most friendly term to get people to join their group, and he wanted to open it up to a few more people. That sounded to him very much World War II and basically modern warfare. He wanted to bring in a more diverse group. Gary was really interested in miniature wargaming. Now, in the United States, miniature wargaming was present, but it was really popular in Europe. And it was a lot harder to get miniatures here in the United States. Very few people were producing them here. Jack Scrooby was one of the main guys producing them. And at times Gary experimented with making his own, but of course he didn't count hiring sculptors to do that. And so Gary was opining in a magazine saying, you know what, I think it wouldn't be too bad if we just took Jack Scrooby's figures and made molds of them and cast them. I mean, what's the harm of that? Well, Jack Scrooby wrote a letter back, and Gary realized, you know, that was his bread and butter, and he was taking food out of that guy's mouth and his family's mouth. And so later on, when Gary would be fighting for the rights for D&D and be on the other side of that, you can understand a lot more where his perspective was, is that was food coming out of the mouth of his family. Now, when the IFW started, they had about 100 people, and Gary helped that to grow to over 700 people by 1972. So the U.S. Continental Army Command, Gary decided, let's rename it to something that brings everybody together. So he named it the International Federation of Wargamers, IFW. And there were a lot of people, especially the people who ran Origins, who thought when he was saying that GenCon was an international convention, they were like, yeah, you have 99% of your people coming from the Midwest and one guy coming from the West Coast, so it's a national convention. So Origins argued that they were the true national convention, and there was kind of a bit of a chest-thumping match between the two of them over the years. But eventually, in 1972, they had grown enough to expand to the Guild Hall, which was the church that was next door across an alley from Horticulture Hall. It had a huge basement, and the advantage to playing in these places was that they all had 12-inch by 12-inch tile floors, and so it made it easy to grid it out for use in wargaming. And the floor of the Guild Hall was sort of a modeled blue floor, so they held all of their Fletcher Pratt naval wargaming there because it was the perfect ocean floor. Now, the first photo you see here, the man standing next to Gary Gygax is Bill Hoyer. He's one of Gary's oldest gaming buddies, and he had attended every GenCon, including GenCon 0, at Gary's house, and they had known each other for all that time, and they were longtime gaming companions. Bill became the president of the IFW and helped put together most of the early GenCons along with Gary. GenCon 1 was all Gary. He basically wrote letters, typed letters, postcards. Gary told me at times he would write up to 12 to 24 letters a day on the weekend, typing, and sending them off, because there was no internet to connect people together. There were a bunch of fanzines out at the time, and the fanzines would get flame wars, just like with the forums today. It just took a little longer for them to gestate. But you can bet when somebody said your game design was stupid in August, by October, you would come up with a really devastating reply. So they took much longer to fulminate, but man, they were wicked when they got to it. Gary liked to write a little bit of poetry, and in one of them he wrote a thing about the life of a soldier, and it was, "I'm glad I'm not a soldier," because you have to get up in the morning, you have to eat crummy food, you have to walk in the rain, and it was just more of a commentary on it. Well, some of the more hawkish wargamers thought he was being a bit of a pacifist and was against war, and this was right at the time of the Vietnam War, and boy, they came down on Gary really hard. And they came back with, "I'm glad Gary Gygax is not a soldier." And so there was a series of harpoons back and forth between the two. But so that sort of thing was pretty common. However, Gary was so pervasive through all of the magazines, all he had to do is say, "I'm going to have a few guys over for a war game," and 100 people showed up to GenCon 1. And then eventually it grew and grew and grew. Now the interesting thing about Gary, like I said, is he didn't drive. But pretty soon he had people driving and taking trains and buses and hiking and flying to the United States, to where by the mid-70s people were coming from England to attend GenCon. Now, the picture you see to the right is a game being played. You see Gary Gygax on the left with the glasses on, in the background with glasses on, and Bill Hoyer's on his right, his gaming buddy. And they are side by side playing Gary's favorite, which is the Huns and the Mongols with horse archers. Because Gary didn't want to get entangled in anything. He wanted to fly by and kill everything as he went. This castle here is an original Alaskan castle. It is a vacuum-formed castle made of plastic. After World War II, the Germans had all of this machinery, high-tech machinery for creating injection plastic molded parts for war machines. and they didn't have any use for it. They couldn't build an army. And so the American bombs, of course, they destroyed and flattened every building, but it is almost impossible to destroy a steel-hardened die and a machine used to operate it. And so that hardened steel usually survived the bomb blasts, and they would just pull it out of the rubble. Well, they had all this great technology, and they developed this injection plastic molding. There was a company called Hauser, which was making miniatures. They used wire armatures, and they used a mixture of glue and sawdust to create composition figures. And their World War I figures were very popular with children to play. Well, after World War II, they had these great injection plastic molding machines, so they retooled their whole line and made sets of these beautiful little plastic miniatures. Now, they came out all orange or flesh toned. Well, after the war, sadly, there was a lot of war widows. There was a lot of German ladies who had families still, but their husbands had all been killed on the Eastern Front or in Africa, or right there in Berlin. So these women needed work, and of course, most of them were untrained. They were only housekeepers, and the Hauser company took a lot of these women in, and they were able to paint these figures on their own in their own homes and make money. And they got paid a couple cents each figure, but a woman could turn out 75 to 100 soldiers a day. Now, they had very specific painting patterns and taught all the women to use the same techniques over and over and over again. So you can get a handful of 30 elastomeric figures, and those were probably made by 30 different war widows throughout the entire production period. Now, when Gary came onto the scene in 1968 with first GenCon, one guy was a good friend with Henry Bodenstadt. Now, Henry Bodenstadt ran a hobby shop in Adelphia, PA. He had a little hobby shop, and he imported these German elastomeric figures from the Hauser company. But he had a good audience with little kids, but Henry was at heart a war gamer, and he had come up with he had formed one of the earliest Avalon Hill Kriegspiel societies. It was called AHIKS, AHIKS, and Henry wanted to devise a way, how am I going to sell more of these Hauser figures? So he decided he would create a war game based around them. And the war game he created was, and I need to signal somebody to give me a bottle of water. Just a moment, I'll be right back.
We'll do hand wave.
Yeah, the guy with the beard, his name is Kevin. So I just went running from 3 games to this. So he created this game called Siege of Bodenberg, after his own name. Now, a burg means a dwelling or a city or something like that. There was this little-known fledgling magazine started by Chris Wagner called Strategy and Tactics, which would later become SPI, run by Jim Dunnigan. Thank you very much.
Very welcome.
So he published it through this magazine in one of the very first issues. And Chris Wagner was in the Air Force, and he was stationed in Osaka, Japan. So he didn't want to distribute from Japan to the United States, where most of his customers were. So he looked for a distributor, and that distributor was Henry Bodenstadt. Henry got the entire shipment of the issues with Siege of Bodenberg in it, and it was spelled B-E-R-G, which, by the way, is how I spell my last name, and in German that means mountain. So iceberg is literally a mountain of ice. So he saw that and he said, it's not a mountain, it's a castle, it should be B-U-R-G, and he refused to distribute the issues. And poor Chris Wagner was sitting on just enough capital to have this printed, plus his own money, and he was not going to get any of the subscriptions out. So he begged and pleaded. He said, I'll do a retraction, and Henry said, you got to reprint it. So eventually they worked out their differences. that he would put an apology in the very next one and have it corrected for every other issue. And the magazine started distributing again. As it was distributed, Henry started handing out these little pamphlets. There's a little tiny booklet on that side, which is the published version of it. He originally ran it in 1965, and the original manuscript for that is next to it, along with the letter that he sent to his buddies saying, come over and play this new game I have. Well, Jerry White is a guy from Oregon, friends with Henry Bodenstadt. He loves the game. He gets all its figures for half off, so that he takes them to game gatherings and plays them with people, and then people call up Henry and say, hey, where do I get those Elastlin figures? So, at the very first GenCon, Jerry White, who was a captain in the U.S. Army during World War II, he drives all the way from Portland, Oregon to Lake Geneva, having gotten letters from Gary to come and play games with a bunch of guys.
I made that drive when my first GenCon.
and someone else who might be from that area, Peter Atkinson. Yes, indeed. So, and thank goodness you do come to GenCon, and thank you for putting all this on.
Thank you.
He is responsible for making all this happen.
Thank you.
So,
Would not have been possible without generous donations and all the great Legends of Wargaming events.
thank you very much, Peter. Okay, so very first GenCon, it was only Saturday, and Gary said he played the game along with his friend Bill Hoyer. He said at the end of the convention on Sunday, they were supposed to be cleaning up and getting out of there and moving all the tables back. So they had so much fun playing Siege of Bodenberg. Gary positioned one of his buddies with a broom in the front of the hall and had him kind of do a little fake sweeping and occasionally slide a chair under a table while they hid back in the corner and continued to play Siege of Bodenberg all afternoon. So Gary was so enamored with that game and the medieval figures from it that he immediately wanted to form a group that under the IFW called the Castle and Crusade Society, which was a medieval enthusiast society. Now, Gary before that was strictly interested in World War II. He loved World War II armor battles, and he loved miniatures as well. But he needed a cheap source of miniatures that were easy and beautiful looking, and that's what the Elastlins were. But it really captured his imagination that they were medieval figures, because not a lot of rule systems explored medieval battle at that time. So Gary starts this group called the Castle and Crusade Society. People start paying their dues. He starts a little magazine called the Domesday Book. A Domesday Book #1 sold in a private auction about 3 years ago for $25,000. Gary typed it up on his IBM Selectric at Fireman's Fund where he was working, and used the IBM photocopier there to run off about 20 copies of that and mail them out to people he wanted to join the society. Of course, everybody cut out the little "I want to join, here's my dollar" for a year's subscription to the Domesday Book and a subscription to being part of the club. So the club started sharing history about medieval warfare. They started sharing games about it. But Gary couldn't build up enough figures to be able to afford to make big armies, even with the collections he was bringing in. And eventually there's this guy named Jeff Perrin who lives in Rockford, Illinois, and runs a hobby shop there. Well, Jeff could buy the figures wholesale, and he had a lot of figures. And so Jeff said, well, sure, I can bring up my figures and we'll just run armies with them. So Gary immediately made him the Baron of the society and said that you're at the top of the heap. So Jeff brings up his figures, and Gary has built a sand table in his basement. There's a sand table over there. It's built in the exact same dimensions that Gary had in his basement. And they would run long campaigns around their medieval figures. And you see a lot of his maps. He'll have a campaign map that shows the Normandy coast, and it's divided up into segments. And then later in magazines, he'll have battle reports where he describes his battles. And if you take the dimensions of those tables, they all lay out to be exactly 6 foot by 10 foot. So Gary is running games using Jeff's Perrin's basic 4 pages, and that's 4 one-sided pages of handwritten rules, which are the mass combat rules for chainmail. Well, after about a year of playing this, the boys are getting a little bored with always playing medieval battles. And Gary, having been told a lot of stories when he was young by his father about Baba Yaga and little kid goats trying to get across bridges, he placed the first fantasy monster into a chainmail game. And when a cavalry unit reached a bridge, a big slimy troll climbed up on the bridge and said, "You may not pass." So, but there were no fantasy figures available at that time. We're talking 1970. So Gary, of course, very stepped in all of the pulp fiction of the day. Loved Robert Howard, loved Jack Vance. He had read Tolkien, wasn't his favorite. He thought there was a lot of boring walking around and very little battling. And so he thought that the sword and sandal sort of adventures were much more titillating, liked those a lot better, and so he modeled much of his wargaming around those. So he starts adding more and more figures, but he has these beautiful 40mm elastilin figures, and he has no monsters. So his son Ernie said there was a little dime store called Shira's Hobby Shop, and Shira's Hobby Shop had Mynah birds. And the Mynah birds would repeat and talk, and they had their little lexicon, and Ernie would go and talk to the Mynah birds while his 38-year-old dad was going through the toy aisle looking for plastic dime store Indians and soldiers to use. And one day he came across a little bag of plastic monsters made in Hong Kong, a la the Godzilla monsters. There's a few of them in this display cabinet over here. You can see, you can just listen, that's fine, you're right here. So these little plastic monsters here, those monsters came out of a little bag out of that dime store, and they were immediately added to the sand table as creatures. And later they'd be added to D&D as part of the mythology of D&D. So this is a creature that didn't exist. Sure, Gary had ogres, he had trolls that he had drawn from mythology, in fact, and he had monsters drawn from Viking mythology, and he had monsters and creatures drawn even from Christianity and Catholicism. Golems are a Jewish creature that is to protect synagogues, and so you have these monsters which were just plastic toys meant for children, and they're suddenly entered into the mythology, which would later become Dungeons and Dragons. And of course, you can see the first figure there is an owl bear. The next one is a boulet, and it is a land shark. And the last one is the ever famous rust monster. And as they picked these things up, they thought, you know, as they picked them up, they kind of said, well, this looks like an owl, but it's got the claws of a bear. I guess it's an owl bear. Grr, 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 hoot, 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 as what Rob Kuntz said when he first marched it across the table, was growl, 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 hoot, hoot, hoot. So the rust monster, you'll see, has been airbrushed across the back, and you see it kind of has a rusty color on it. So it immediately became the rust monster, and its powers followed with that. And of course, the land shark was famously written up eventually for D&D by Tim Kask, when Gary said, well, I don't know, make up stats for it. And so Tim saw that it had the little crest on the back, and it kind of looked like an armadillo, so he decided to make it a land shark. And of course, Tim really loved Saturday Night Live at the time, and of course, land shark was a big popular thing, where a shark would come up to the door and knock, and it would say, "Candygram." I didn't order any candy, and then it would come up with some other excuse, and eventually it would say, "Land shark, walk in and eat everybody." So Gary started adding all of these fantasy elements to the game. The chainmail is eventually published with the fantasy section in 1971. Now, Dave Arneson has already met Gary Gygax in 1969 at the second GenCon. They played a few war games together, they talked, and Dave Arneson tells him he has this neat game for naval warfare in the Napoleonic age called "Don't Give Up the Ship," after the famous slogan, after the famous motto of the Admiral of the U.S. Navy. So Dave was very famous for liking a lot of hot dogs at GenCon. And John Bobeck, the editor of the IFW, always worked alongside the Gygax children to hand out hot dogs and sodas at GenCon. So when John Bobeck was at GenCon 3 in 1970, Dave was coming around and had run out of cash for hot dogs, and John said, you know, if you give me a copy of your naval rules, I'll give you a free hot dog. So John Bobeck actually traded the hot dogs to get Dave Arneson to give him a copy of the rules. Eventually they get published in the IFW Monthly, the fanzine for the IFW. Gary Gygax sees it, starts talking about Dave Arneson. They collaborate and publish D-Guts in 1971 along with Gary's Chainmail. Now, as Arneson is developing his own role-playing game, he's been playing Braunsteins with a guy named Dave Arneson. Braunstein is basically a bunch of individuals in a city called Braunstein, in a little town called Braunstein. And each of them has a role, and they play their role, and they get awarded points based on how successful they are in whatever they are. So the head of the college gets the students to stop striking, and the mayor of Braunstein says, okay, well, I'll tell the militia to back down. And so all of these things happen and are negotiated face to face without any rules. It's just how you role play amongst each other. The rules were very informal. There weren't any dice rolling or anything like that. It was all resolved by a referee. So the combination of Chainmail coming out with fantasy elements and Dave Arneson has started already, before Chainmail is even published, a series of adventures set in medieval times, because Dave Arneson had already joined at the beginning of 1971 the Castle and Crusade Society and is starting to get interested in medieval stuff, just as Gary had. The two of them come together, and eventually Dave Arneson, inspired by the fantasy elements, incorporates more and more fantasy into his game, and they've been playing for about a year by the time, or about 5 or 6 months before they even start going into a dungeon. And there is no doubt that Dave Arneson clearly is the innovator of fantasy role-playing, and especially dungeon adventuring. Now, Gary came up with the idea of mixing fantasy with wargaming, and David Wesley came up with this sort of concept of role-playing, throwing various sources together, and then Dave Arneson riffs on those two and makes fantasy role-playing and fantasy dungeon adventuring. But it still wasn't Dungeons and Dragons yet. He had to meet Gary Gygax, and the two had to come together to mesh the two. And there's something very interesting in one of the depositions of Gary Gygax. If you go and look at the public record, you can find the various legal arguments that went on. And in one of the depositions, Gary is trying to prove who wrote what parts of D&D. And the argument was that Gary was truly the better organizer and collator, and that Dave did come up with ideas for the game. So they were trying to decide how it all hashed out. But as you recall, Gary's interest in the sword and sorcery game and fantasy, when it came to a letter that was written by Dave Arneson to Gary, they asked Gary, so what is this letter where Dave is asking you what are the sources of D&D? And that was very interesting to the lawyers, because if Dave Arneson didn't know what the sources of D&D are, how could he have created it? Well, the real reason behind that was that Gary really liked all this sword and sorcery pulp, and he really drew from all the amazing engines. Now, Dave Arneson was much younger and wasn't as much in the 30s and 40s pulps as Gary was, but he was still interested reading Howard and Tolkien. But people were coming up at conventions after D&D had been created and complaining, you know, why are elves like this? You know, elves shouldn't be like this, and the magic system is stupid. Why do you cast a spell and forget it? And how can you only cast a couple spells a day? And why is this rigid? And why are the fighters like this? And why do things happen like this? And Dave Arneson didn't have those answers. And the reason he didn't have those answers is because Gary drew a lot of the chainmail monsters, some from his complete imaginations, like the plastic monsters, some from just adaptations, and some from mythology, and a lot from the fantasy pulp he was reading. And so he said, well, the sources of D&D, the magic system, comes from Jack Vance. That's you memorize things and you forget them, and you can only memorize so many things a day, and that's where that comes from. So Gary has to explain the sources of the sort of genre of D&D, not necessarily what role-playing is. So it's an important distinction. Anyways, Arneson says in GenCon 1972, he tells Gary about this game. And so Gary invites him down and says, come down to Lake Geneva and show me what this game is. Now, after they had been adventuring for a couple months, David McGarry, a good friend of Dave Arneson, started to feel bad that Dave couldn't play his own game. Dave was running Napoleonics games for dozens and dozens of people, his big club, and he was managing all the resources and planning, and he had his own newsletter like Gary had called Corner of the Tabletop. And he was posting all of these updates from his Blackmore campaign, and he didn't really have a lot of time to be playing any games. So David McGarry was very interested in computers and was a bit of a programmer. And he thought, how can I make a game that Dave can play? So let's go over here. It's over here, but it's really chronologically over there. So come over here. You guys got it? So this was David McGarry's answer to getting Dave Arneson to be able to play his own game. And Dave, a lot of the early adventures were wandering around the countryside and the town of Blackmore. Just like the Bronsteins, they weren't set in a dungeon because that concept wasn't there yet. But there was a town with a castle, and there was eventually a dungeon as the game progressed. So Dave decided that the outdoor stuff in the town, that was way too hard to model into a board game. But the dungeon adventure, which has been going on for a couple months, was much more compartmentalized. You went down channels and you had choices, and if you made one choice, you could only go down that channel, and all choices had consequences, which opened up new choices or closed down your options. So he created this game on a feverish Sunday afternoon in October. And he sat down with some manila envelopes and some index cards and started cutting them up into little squares and tiles and writing them as he designed. And of course, it was all broken down into little squares so he could stick it in his satchel or in the little envelope it came in. And he wrote all of the creatures in all the rooms. And if you look at the list of creatures, it's all of the creatures from Chainmail. It's all of the fantasy monsters from Chainmail, and then they add a couple at the end, which are his own monsters, which were probably in the original Blackmore dungeons. Now, he had levels, and the levels of the dungeon were progressively tougher. Now, that is an innovation that was Dave Arneson's as well. Now, the idea of levels and stronger troops is in Chainmail. A regular guy is worth one person, and a hero is worth 4 persons, and a superhero is worth 8 persons. And so they get progressively tougher. So while it doesn't say levels and it's not particularly granular, you don't go first level, second level, third level, there is the concept of having stronger and weaker wizards, where this is a wizard normal and this is a wizard -1. And so that would be the difference between an 11th level wizard and a 10th level necromancer. As the game developed, those things got more and more complex. So Dave is feverishly drawing this. He was in the draft, but he had a lung problem, and he got a medical discharge from the medical classification for his draft, and it ended up didn't going. And Dave Arneson also had a medical classification where he didn't end up going, even though he was in ROTC. So Dave can't go back to college because he's in the middle of the school year. It's October. He's not going into the military and not going to Vietnam. And he is kind of sick. He doesn't have a job. And so he's playing these games with Dave Arneson, and he wants to give something back to Dave. So he creates this dungeon. And his sister comes downstairs, his little sister comes downstairs, and Dave's about 19 years old at the time. His little sister comes downstairs and says, "What you doing, Dave?" He goes, "I made this game, and it's just like it. It's got these monsters, and there's dragons over here in the street, and you play heroes, and you go in there, and you get fantastic treasure." And she goes, "Well, it's boring." And he goes, "What? What do you mean it's boring?" And she goes, "Well, there's nothing in the little spaces." And so as he was drawing, she started doodling and making little skeletons and webs and monsters to fill up all the spaces to make it look more interesting. Yes, and so all of these little skeletons, in addition, are Dave's sister. And eventually she did get bored with it and quit drawing, as you can see. But you can tell right about when she came in and started doodling after he was finishing section after section. Well, later, when TSR would publish this, this becomes that becomes the way they always display the board, with the little spaces in between being filled with little bits of fantasy miniatures. So they get to Lake Geneva to demonstrate the role-playing game Blackmore. But they're a little nervous how it might go over with Gary because it's pretty unusual. And a lot of wargamers don't really appreciate what they're doing. There's no miniatures involved. So they're in Gary Gygax's dining room on 330 Center Street. So you're Gary. Gary sits right here at the corner. So go ahead. And then Rob Kuntz, who is almost like an adopted son to Gary, would always sit next to him. But Terry, his half brother, because their mother had been institutionalized for mental illness, and Rob was almost like an orphan. And Gary Gygax kind of took Rob under his wing. He was only 13, 14 years old when he first met Gary in '68. And, he was just a little kid in a small town with nothing to do. And he's eventually introduced to Gary and becomes friends with Gary, and really is so interested in what Gary is doing and really needs a father figure that he becomes like a son to Gary. So Rob always sat right next to Gary. But Terry, Rob's half brother, who kind of liked to get Rob's goat every once in a while. He has a very wry sense of humor. Had arrived a little bit early and sat right next to Gary. So Rob shows up and he can't sit there. So Rob sits here, and Dave Arneson is sitting over here, and David McGarry are sitting here across the table. And they show them this board game, and it's all cool and everything, and it's pretty much a standard board game. It's got a lot of really cool elements. The combat system, you roll 2 6-sided dice, and you have to get over a certain score to kill the monster. Well, that is the basis for fantasy combat in chainmail. You roll 2 dice and you try to get a high enough score to kill the monster. Also, there are wizards in the game, and they can attack monsters with fireballs and lightning bolts. And so you see all of these elements come from chainmail, and they're codified into Dave Arneson's concept of a fantasy dungeon adventure using the monsters drawn from chainmail, and you play a hero, a superhero, a wizard in the game. And eventually they open it up to dwarves and elves. So you've got all these characters adventuring in this game, and it's an interesting game, but the game that they really want to know about is the other one, because it doesn't sound like a board game. And so far, the only way they've been able to interpret it is saying it's a variant of chainmail. And it's not a variant of chainmail at all. It uses a lot of chainmail, but role-playing, entirely different animal. So they start playing this game, and they kind of wander around the marshes around Blackmore. They run into a big group of soldiers. They flee from the soldiers. They go into a cave or a dungeon. They run into some trolls. They get chased with a wizard with fire. So all of this happens, and then they go home. and they go back to Minnesota, and Rob goes home back to his house, which he's 2 blocks away, but there's nothing in between. He can walk from his front door straight to Gary's house, and so Gary is sitting there, and Gary's just buzzing. He's just like, that was something new. That was something new. That's something exciting. That's something that isn't restricted by the limitations of wargaming. You know, wargamers are very serious about having that Brunswicker's buttons run. And so it's limiting and it's intimidating, because if you come into the game with your painted miniatures you think look pretty cool, and they go, Brunswickers have silver buttons, not gold. And their hats, blue, wrong! And they're supposed to be royal blue. So it is a little intimidating because they are about the history. And you can't just make stuff up. So Gary loves miniatures. He sees this miniatures crowd, but Gary is full of whimsy. I can't take this right now. I'm in the middle of a tour and there's 30 people waiting for me to talk. Let's see, where's my speaker? Victoria? This is Victoria Perrin, Jeff Perrin's daughter, author of Chainmail. Say hi, Victoria.
Hi,
Victoria. Okay, Victoria, I have to call you back. Bye. Okay, not to name drop. Okay, so Gary has a lot of whimsy, right? He hasn't been reading just history books. He's been reading pulp fantasy, and he knows there's a lot more out there. And Chainmail has just introduced him to the concept of bringing all that into wargaming. And there is a wargamer who is very good friends with Gary, and they had written stuff together and they gamed together a lot. But he was a serious wargamer. And when Gary started bringing fantasy elements into the game, he stopped talking to Gary. They had known each other for 5 or 6 years and would see each other every weekend to wargame. Stopped talking to him. So Gary had a group of Brunswickers from the town of Braunschweig. And he decided that his commander of the forces, he was messing around painting, and Gary would love to scratch build, to custom build, to modify figures, because he had to get the details right. Oh no, these Roco mini tanks, they've got the gas tanks on the front. That's supposed to be on the back, and there's no jerry can over there, it's over here. And he would get everything exact, because he was a wargamer, and he wanted to get along with the crowd. But the whimsy started sneaking in at this time, and his Napoleonic Brunswickers, who are these badass guys, who wear black uniforms, and they got a black hat, and they got a badge, which is Skull and Crossbones, and that's black too. I mean, they are black, and they are bad dudes. And so they're the Black Brunswickers, and they are the Death Legion. They're the badass guys. Well, they're also from the town of Braunschweiger, so, which is famous for something else. So as Gary's looking at a little piece of sprue on his table, it's kind of oblong, and it has little round ends, and it's got little kind of flashing at the end of it. So he takes a candle and kind of heats it up and bends it a little bit in a gentle curve, and then he sticks it right on the end of his Brunswicker commander's sword, right at the tip of his cutlass, and then paints it pink and puts a little yellow band around it. And then the first battle, everybody is like, oh, ha, 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 ha. And Gary's about to sound the charge, everything's going back and forth, and it's time to bring in the cav. And he's got his captain right there at the lead, and he holds up his sword, and he's got it ready to go, and then Gary pulls out an Oscar Mayer weenie whistle and goes, doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo, to sound his charge, and off they go. Well, that did not make the other wargamers at the table too loud. So Gary is clearly looking for an outlet for his whimsy and his desire to have fantasy in. Gary's also really inclusive. Wargaming seems to be exclusive, because you're either interested in this or that, and you're not interested in this at all. If you notice, when Dungeons & Dragons comes around, It is not just a bunch of medieval guys carrying buckets of manure and losing their teeth and dying of bubonic plague. He's got everything in there. He's got ogres in there, which come from British mythology. He's got Oriental ogres, which come from Japanese mythology. He's got giants from Viking mythology. He's got Judeo-Christian spells in there, and he's got magic from Lord of the Ring, and he's got elves and dwarves from North, and he's got it all mixed together. He's got dime store plastic figures that are new things that didn't even exist before. So he's got this whole amalgam. So whether you are interested in mythology, or you're interested in medieval warfare, or you're interested in Oriental mythology or stories, it doesn't matter. He has something for everybody. There's a little something for everybody. There, in original D&D books, there's Martians in the book. You can run into Martians in the dungeon. And you know, there's lots of lasers and technology in the game too. So it's all there. So if you like one particular flavor, it's there for you in the game. So, Dave has brought this game. Gary's played it. He's buzzing. He sees the potential. He has no idea what to do with it, but it's exciting. Rob's at home in bed, and Gary's a 38-year-old guy. He's not going to call Rob in the middle of the night, but very first thing the next morning, he calls Rob. What did you think of that game? Why don't you come over and let's run our own game? And so Rob comes over the next day or the day after that, and they get together, and they have a hex paper, because all the gamers were using hex paper at the time. And Rob kind of runs the game, and Gary says, hey, go to this hex. Well, there's jungles in it. Well, I go to this hex. There's a river, and you have to cross it. And they kind of do their own map, and they go about 25 hexes and reach the tower. They go through the forest of Dun, and they reach the unnamed tower. Now, what actually happened in that adventure, not really sure. But then they started thinking, well, let's see. We're just talking, and we're just using pencils and paper. There's no game here. How do we sell this? And they thought, well, maybe we could play games and write fiction based on it and publish it, and people can buy our stories. Or maybe it is a set of rules, and we come up with a set of rules, but we got to have the rules. So they called Dave Arneson the next day and said, Dave, send us the rules. And of course, Dave Arneson is thinking, well, this is a pen and pencil game that you just talk, and you just, like Braunstein's, you really don't use dice for much of anything. Now, he did use dice, but it was pretty much whatever he decided to use. If it was an armor rule from a naval system, if it was a hit rule from chainmail, he just brought it in from all over and combined it with role-playing. He put all those elements together to make a fantasy role-playing game. So when Gary said the rules, I'm sure all the guys in Minnesota were like, what rules? We had no idea, because when he ran that little game, he had notes, and occasionally he rolled dice, but it was all behind the screen. They had no idea what he was doing. So Dave sends them the rules. They start getting developed over the years, and the rules are basically a list of chainmail monsters and a few rules from Strategos N. But the whole thing was actually in the play of it. It was in Dave's mind, and now it was in Gary's mind, and it lit a fire. Gary and Arneson collaborated, tinkered back and forth. Dave would always say that it was never really ready. We're way past time, but I have a little time to continue talking, and I'll continue talking. So it's 11 now. I'll just keep talking. So it looks like we'll only get to about GenCon 1975 in the next 10 minutes, but I'll do it. All right, Gary develops manuscripts, starts sending out manuscripts to friends, and eventually D&D starts to form up. Gary is working for Don Laurie of Guidon Games, and Don moves to Maine. And to show you how close of a confidant and a protege that Rob Kuntz was, Gary was thinking of taking a job and moving to Maine with Don Laurie. And at the time when they were trying to decide whether they were making that move, the whole family, Gary and his family of five kids, he and his wife, they brought Rob in and said, when Rob would come over when he was old enough to drink, he had his own bottle of Southern Comfort on the shelf in the bar, and that was his. And when he'd come over and have a drink, that's what he had. So they brought Rob over, sat him down at the dining room table and said, Rob, we're thinking about moving, so we think we're gonna adopt you. What do you think about us adopting you? So that really shows you how close Rob was to this whole thing. As Gary typed and wrote things, Rob sat on the floor and he would hand him drafts and Rob would read it over and he would give Gary constant feedback. And so Gary really needed Rob and Rob really needed Gary. And so he was really a part of their family. So they've been developing this game through this time, and they ask, but Gary ultimately decides, no, I'm not going to go. I can't really work for Guide Games. I know it's going to end badly. He decides he's going to form his own game called TSR, Tactical Studies Rule. And he gets his buddy Don Kay to pitch in a little money. They want to publish D&D. And Gary can see there are games that are getting more and more interested in fantasy. And there are some games that seem to have role-playing elements, and he thinks it's getting closer and closer to the target, what he thinks the game is. And he's afraid somebody's going to scoop him. And Dave Arneson is like, I think swords should have intelligence and be a little different, and maybe we should have a few more abilities. Here's my, and Gary's like, no, we gotta get this thing out the door. And so it's getting close towards Christmas. And Gary really wants a Christmas release, right? It's getting closer and closer and closer, and the concept of role-playing games is circling the drain. There are games out there which you could call a role-playing game. They might not be published, they're playing by groups of people. There are fantasy campaigns which are being played. It's getting close. So, despite Dave Arneson saying it's not right yet, Gary pushes it to get it published. His plan was to get Cavaliers and Roundheads, another game authored with Jeff Perrin, out the door to pay for it. But he can't. He brings in Brian Bloom, brings in money. They get it published in January. Now, they get it published right at the beginning of January. Now, all you people who are familiar with Kickstarters, you get your $50,000 up front, and then you make the thing. He spent all this money to make this thing, and it's ready. It's come off the printer, and he has to start selling it. And he's sending out letters to everybody. There's this great fantasy game, and he's been seeding the waters since about 1972, working on this interesting game that involves fantasy, and people are buzzing about it. Tolkien has been released in the United States, and people are interested. And then he gets it back from the printer. He writes a letter to Dave Arneson, which is right over there. The booklets look great. He's so excited. They don't sell a copy until the end of January. He's got 1,000 copies of this game that he's invested, his friends. Gary Gygax in 1971 with a family of 5 made $781 all year. And he came to his wife and he said, honey, I know I got fired from Fireman's Fund, but you know, what I'd really like to do is design games. And Mary Jo, with a 1-year-old Luke Gygax on her lap, and all these little babies running around, is like, but what does she say? She says, yes, because it's what you want to do. So all of this and all of Dungeons & Dragons is really credit to that decision and her willing to make that sacrifice for him to be happy. So it's a pretty important point of all this. So he does all that. He leads up to it. He has no money, and he gets this published, and not a single sale to the first month. Well, GenCon 1973, Dave Arneson told me, yeah, you know, we ran D&D, but we didn't really tell anybody what it was. So this is GenCon's, GenCon, what did I just say? 1973, that's GenCon 6. So at GenCon 6, they're going to run this game. And, but they don't really announce it too much, because they're afraid that all these wargamers, Gary's going to get the reaction where they're going to be mad. Because there's no fantasy role players existing up to that time. There's people playing chainmail, and some of them are using fantasy. But there's no role-playing game, there's no fantasy up to that GenCon 6. So they're about to bring this game on the scene that doesn't have any miniatures. It doesn't have a board. And so they're afraid what the reaction is going to be. So Dave Arneson said, we played it down a little bit. The program is right over there. And if you open it up and look at it, which you can't because it's under plexiglass, but I have, and it says, fantasy game. which Gary has often said was the placeholder name for the game before he decided on Dungeons and Dragons, was the fantasy game. So it just says fantasy game. It doesn't say war game or fantasy miniatures, because those were games that were happening in previous years. So Arneson says they actually use miniatures, not because they needed them, but because they didn't want to look too out of place. And the other thing is that D&D, because it was based on imagination, quickly outstripped the ability to model it. And despite Gary having dragons and ogres and trolls and wizards and all that stuff in chainmail, by the time it became D&D, it was so vastly expanded because it was only the limits of your mind. They couldn't represent it anymore with figures on the board. And so they secretly play this game, and it receives a pretty positive reception, but it's still an unknown. Eventually, 1974 comes around, and Gary runs the next GenCon. TSR, he's still not getting paid. The game's been out for just a couple months, and Rob Kuntz is running around and has taken a level out of Castle Greyhawk, which is called the Machine level, which doesn't have anything to do with fancy. It's a bunch of freaking robots and they chop you up into little pieces. And they get into there, and so he's running this. And Tim Kask, that was the first time. He was a serious, rules so gritty it rubs your fingerprints off sign of wargamer. And he's like, sure, what the hell, I'll play this game. And he goes and sits down with Rob and a group of people, and he plays a dwarf, and he says, I was encased in lucite and cut into 1,000 1-inch cubes at the end of the game. But he said, hell yes, I was hooked. And so eventually he would come and work for Gary and TSR. Well, 1975 starts to roll around. Now the game's taken off. Now they're selling 3,000 copies, and they make another printing of 3, and they're starting to sell copies. Gary hasn't gotten paid yet. Don Kay hasn't gotten paid yet. They have been working for free for the company since 1973-40. Now, Gary got royalties, but he was getting 5% royalties on a book that was selling for $5. So he wasn't raking in the cash. So, but as this went along, eventually people started bringing copies. They started making photocopies. Well, Bob at the dorm over in Sando's dorm, he's got 14. He's got a copy of it, and so they go down to the science lab and they photocopy off copies for all their buddies. Pretty soon, everybody in the dorm has copies. So here they are at GenCon. Gary just hasn't even started getting paid yet. I don't believe he starts getting paid till later in 1975. But here it is, August. He's just started getting paid, or he's going to start getting paid, and some kid comes up to him and goes, hey, would you sign my copy of Dungeons & Dragons? And it is not a copy, it is a photocopy of the rules. And everybody was complaining, what? $10 for rules? That's like 27 bucks. I'm not gonna pay that for a couple of cheap little war game rules. And so, because you could pay 50 cents, $1.50 for a set of rules from an amateur designer. So they said, sure, and would rip them up. And Gary would have, his buddies would see this happening, and Gary would say, don't let them use these, they have to buy the rules. Now, later, it would become a pretty big controversy when Gary would write editorials saying, hey, you're ripping off our stuff. And when TSR would say, hey, Tunnels and Trolls, that's a ripoff of our game. And the Tunnels and Trolls would say, it's not a ripoff of your game, it's a whole new game. We wrote the whole thing. And they would point out, well, on page 12, you say, for movement, refer to the D&D booklets. So it was pretty hard to prove that it wasn't the same dang game. But anyways, it started opening up everybody's eyes to the possibilities. And pretty soon, even though the wargamers were starting to get displaced by fantasy, because remember, wargaming was very narrowing, because you had people who had to be more and more interested in it, as opposed to people who could make up anything. Because you don't need to know what the Brunswickers buttons are. In D&D, it's magic. They're silver, or they're, dragon's blood. I don't know, whatever they are. And so more people were involved with it. It was an amalgam of all sorts of fantasy and mythology, and it brought in all walks of life, from the very youngest to the very oldest. There were times where when little kids would come up to the table, that the older war gamers would turn them away because they were just a snot-nosed kid. There was a war game company, a group called Sparta, and you had to refer people as Mr. You couldn't call them by their first name unless they gave you permission. So there'd be these kids going, Mr. Gygax, can I play war games? And of course Gary was like, I'm Gary, nice to meet you. How about you play this unit over here? And so he wanted everybody to be involved. So like GenCon, Gary didn't drive. Gary never learned how to drive. And he had an incident when he was a little kid that they think was so harrowing when he stole his father's car and almost died that he never drove, and he just didn't drive. Now, Rob Kunze said he could drive, but he was nervous about driving. So he never drove. So if you notice, the first GenCon, one block is at Gary's house. The next GenCon is literally one block down from Gary's house. And then the American Legion House, 3 blocks. But he has people coming from all over the country, all over the world, little kids, 50, 60, 70-year-old guys, all coming in to play games with him. There's one guy from Indiana, where we're at now. He's from Indianapolis. He was 17 years old and found out GenCon 1 was happening. His name was Doug Crago. 17-year-old kid. Now think about your kids. If you got kids now, your 17-year-old kid in your family car. And he wants to drive from Indianapolis through Chicago up to Lake Geneva, Wisconsin to go to this game for one day. And your parents say, oh, sure, go ahead. And why don't you take the 8mm camera with you, and you should film it too. Now I've called Doug, and he's gone through his mom's house. He can't find the film. But think about that, a 17-year-old kid feeling so safe and welcome by Gary's letters and all of the advertisement that he travels all that distance in his family's car, and his parents trust him to do it on his own. And he shows up and he attends the game and becomes a long-time attendee. So that ability of Gary to draw all these people together, the way Dungeons and Dragons was designed at its very core, drew people together. And pretty soon you have a huge expansion of the people coming to GenCon. You also have all the game designs of people who played GenCon, played D&D, and now are inspired to come up with their own design. The box of Traveler by Mark Miller over there. It's a digest-sized box, just like D&D. It's got 3 booklets for characters, creatures, and adventures. It's the same design, but it's a totally different mechanics and a totally different genre. And so that starts opening up GenCon to all sorts of vendors and contributors who want to partake in it. And it grows and grows through the years and eventually gets large enough, as it is now, to be truly the largest convention in North America. So I've gone on for 16 minutes. I only got to 1975. So I'll do 4 minutes of questions, and then we'll move on. So anybody have any questions? Anything you're interested in?
Is there a record of the first international attendee?
Well, the only one I know of that's recorded is Ian Livingston in 1976, and he was a British guy who just opened a little game shop called Games Workshop with his buddy Steve Jackson. And Steve Jackson and Ian decided, it'd be kind of cool if we flew in to the West Coast and then rented a car and drove it all the way to Lake Geneva. And at the time they had the McDonald's Monopoly game was playing. So they'd walk into a place and go, "Hello, love. I'd like to get a hamburger, and I'd like to get a side order of fries." And they go, "Oh my goodness, are you British?" And so all these people would start talking to them, and they would see that they would have that they were playing the Monopoly game, and they go, "Well, we have these. Would you like ours?" And they're like, "Well, sure." And so as they met Americans and went through the country, they were being given all these Monopoly pieces, and they were piecing them together, and they ate nothing but McDonald's all the way across the country. So the jalopy they were driving had some mechanical issues, as did their bodies. So eventually they get all the way across, and some of the best pictures of Gary from that convention are here. And so that picture of Gary you see right up front, that real close-up, great color photo, that's one of Ian Livingston's photos that he took when he was at that GenCon.
So the old stuff, the originals, this is all originals from there?
Yeah, and so, for example, like that Elastalin castle, Gary realized that Dave had his own castle, Blackmore, and Dave had this old castle called the Branzel Castle, which is a little castle model put out by a German company called Kibri. And they used it as Castle Bronstein in the Bronstein games. And later, when they played Blackmore, he used it as Castle Blackmore. But Gary realized that, well, I want to come up with a dungeon like Dave, I need a castle. And he knew he had the Elastalin castle in the basement that he used for his wargaming. So he went down there and he drew out the floor plan of Castle Greyhawk on graph paper. But of course, it's square, so he elongated the curtain walls to make it a rectangular castle. And the upper works were only ruins, but in all of the stories of Castle Greyhawk, they always talk about the central tower. And if you look at that model, it has a central tower. And that was the entrance to the original dungeons. And so that's how that plays into that mythology. So there's Castle Greyhawk right there. And if you wonder, you know, the DNA of D&D, in addition to coming from Bronsteins and Dave Arneson, but the DNA of D&D comes from Gary's sand table. Because if you want to know why a horse moves 24, it's because Gary wanted it to be able to cross the 6-foot sand table in 3 moves. The reason why a person in heavy plate moves only 6 inches is because he wanted it to take 10 turns to get us across the table. So the whole metrics of movement are scaled to that sand table. If you want to know why an ogre is 9 foot tall and has yellowish skin, it's because Gary couldn't find any ogre figures. So when he was in that dime store with Ernie, he found a bunch of Mark's toy Indians, which are 54 millimeters in height. When you scale that to a 40 millimeter Elastalin figure, it comes up to be 9 foot tall. So when he was going through the monster manual and detailing and making details, he looked at the ogre figures, and you can see them right here in yellow. That's why ogres have yellowish tan hide, because that's the injection plastic molding they made them with. Now those ogre figures have been modified from original Mark's figures. And if you look at the clothes of the ogre, it's the exact same clothes as the ogre in the Monster Manual. So when Dave Sutherland was at 330 Center Street, GSR's original offices, Gary's house, he said, "Gary, what do you want ogres to look like?" Gary went downstairs and grabbed an ogre and came running back up and said, "This is what ogres look like." And that's where the metrics and the DNA of D&D really comes from, is a lot of this. And you get a lot of monsters, a lot of creatures, a lot of spells, a lot of effects, all come from this. And that is the world, which is the metric or the DNA, which is integral through D&D. Dwarves move the same in chainmail. They move the same in D&D. They move the same in AD&D. They move the same in 2nd edition. And that's the DNA of the game. And even when you play later editions, dwarves still have to move just as slow. And it all goes back to chainmail and that sand table.
That's interesting.
So, That was a long answer for a short question. I'm full of long answers for short questions. So any more?
When did they come up with the name D&D, and what were some of the competing names, or did they have any?
I've been reading a lot of stuff by Gary over a long period of time, and Gary always wanted to be a fantasy novel writer. And so he used a lot of tricks. When you write a novel, you have to have a lot of names. So Gary would do all sorts of tricks, like he would write the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, blah, 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 and then he would make up names, blah, 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 and he would just be forced to use the first letter to make up names. Or he would use his children's name and make an anagram of it. Like the Drow city of Errol High Sinlu is Ernie, Heidi, Cindy, Luke. And so to us, it sounds like a fantastic fantasy. That's brilliant. It sounds so clever.
Sorry.
But he had to make up so many names and generate so much fantasy pulp to deal with that he would use various tricks. So Dungeons and Dragons, he used a trick where he used 2 columns of names: swords, sandals, dungeons, dragons, fantasy, wizard, warriors, and he did all of these together. And then he would go through them and he would sound them out, and eventually alliteration sounded better. Warriors and wizards, fantasy fighting, and and he had all these things, but eventually he says that his youngest daughter Cindy, as he presented a list of them once he had narrowed them down, said Dungeons and Dragons, and she said, "Oh, Daddy, I like that one." Yes.
When did Gary actually invent the Great Kingdom campaign, and did it predate Blackmoor or no?
Well, this game that's being played right now is called Battle for the Brown Hills, and was published in November of 1971 in the Wargamers newsletter, which was a British wargaming magazine that involved miniatures. And so Gary decided to submit a battle report. A battle report is just basically saying, hey, we fought this war game, I won, and this is how it went. So, and then they critique it a little bit, maybe if we had done this or that, but when we did this, that was the end of the battle. And so wargamers would share these battle reports. Well, Gary shared a battle report of Brown Hills because he had created chainmail and he wanted people to be interested in it. So he wanted to start sharing stories. Remember the concept of what do we do with this game? Well, maybe we could write fiction based on it. Well, a battle report is basically fiction based on how a game went. Now, Margaret Weiss says, well, you can't create a novel based on gameplay because it goes like this. In a novel, you need to go like this. But Gary created lots of stories. You just have a shorter story that's just this part. So anyways, he submitted that report, and it was called Battle for the Brown Hills. Well, the Brown Hills has a section where they write in the very beginning, it says, so I got the boys together from Madison, and they came down to Lake Geneva, and we ran a fantasy war game using our chainmail rules. He said, I dug out an old fantasy map. So I don't know what the origin of the old fantasy map was, but he lists the Brown Hills, and the Sea of Dust is to the southwest. The Barrier Peaks are to the west, the Giant Mountains, and soon you start seeing bits and pieces of what most people are familiar with Greyhawk, but are critical geographical elements. For example, there's a Valley of Eos, and there is Lake Eos, which is the main demigod and leader and country in the world of Greyhawk later. And then there is a kingdom over to the side called the Great Kingdom. So the forces of law, which are on the far side, have come through the Great Kingdom. And they are going into the Brown Hills, and the Brown Hills are named Brown because they're brown. And the evil forces are moving through it. You have Orcs of the Vile Rune, which non-PC have shields with Arabic runes across them. And there are Orcs of the Long Spear, who are Turks with long spears. And he goes on and gives them all fantasy names. So they're still his Elastolan figures, and they're still medieval figures, but he's transmogrifying them into different designations. He's added his ogres, And then my favorite story, what was I talking about? Before I go too far. Oh, Origin of the Great Kingdom. So this whole campaign came from that old map. It becomes the Castle and Crusades Great Society map, and then eventually becomes the World of Greyhawk map, and is used in D&D, and then later he expands it to a huge map to become the first World of Greyhawk map published, as we know it. Anyways, my favorite is, in this game, one of my favorite mods is his giant. There were no giant figures, but figures came in 15 millimeter and 20 millimeter and 25 millimeter and 30 and 40 and 54 millimeter and 70 millimeter. Well, he needed a giant. He wanted him to be really big. So the Elastilon company made figures in 40 millimeter sizes for people who wanted to play, but they also made larger 70 millimeter figures. So he took a Viking figure. Hey guys, can I borrow your giant for a minute? Just fun. Yeah. They'll need him back shortly, trust me. So he took a Viking who had a big round shield and a huge spear, had a sword or spear in his hand, and was just laying back, throwing the spear like that. And so what he did was he trimmed off the shield, and he decided he trimmed off the Viking horns and the helmet, and then he decided, well, he needs a big club because he's a giant. So he took a matchstick, because Gary was a smoker, rolled his own camels, wooden matchstick, took that and added some auto body putty to it to make it nice and lumpy. And he said, but then the giant just, he just had a regular Viking helmet on, so he went upstairs and rummaged around in his daughter's room and found Malibu Barbie lying there. And poor Malibu Barbie didn't know what hit her, but she soon had a haircut. And Gary kind of glued all of her little doll hair right on there, just like a fright wig for the giant. And then he painted the skin blue, and that became his giant Vertimer, the king of the giants. And you'll notice he almost looks, he has the same cloud blue coloration that cloud giants have later in the monster manual. So that's just,
Are the originals?
No. Now, Gary knew there were no fantasy figures, and just like groups who do kit bashing and custom models and scratch building, they want to share with how they did it, right? This is how fantastic it looks. Everybody's like, oh my gosh, how'd you do it? And then they're only too happy to say, this is how I did it. And so Gary, realizing he had created a game for fantastic creatures which didn't exist, it's pretty hard to sell a game where you can't find anything to play it when it's a miniatures game. So he very eagerly shared all of that information about the game, and he said exactly how to do this miniature. So I had my friend Kevin here in the beard and the cap. We followed Gary's instructions exactly, and we used an actual matchstick. We used auto body putty. I ordered a Malibu Barbie from 1970. Poor thing, never knew what hit her. And this is an original Elastilon figure. That's a 70 millimeter thing. And so we did it just like Gary did. So it's basically a reconstruction or a reenactment. And we did a lot of that for this game using all Elastilon figures.
Awesome. They look good.
Okay, Vertimer has returned to the battlefield.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? And then I probably should get water. All right, thank you all very, 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 very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. I appreciate that.
What was your name again?
Paul Stormberg.
Yeah, so it's which are the winning. Thank you.